Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some pretty deep waters today. We're talking Christian mysticism, and our guide is none other than St. John of the Cross.
A fantastic choice.
Specifically, his work Dark Night of the Soul will be using the translation by E. Allison Piers. Now, I'll be honest, the title alone kind of gave me the chills, you know. Made me think of something, well, pretty bleak.
I can see that.
But digging deeper, it's clear this dark night isn't about depression or feeling hopeless or anything like that. It's about something way bigger, a total spiritual shift, like a metamorphosis.
You hit the nail on the head. And Piers, in his introduction, he gets this perfectly. He says St. John of the Cross has this amazing way of writing spiritual poetry that just soars, but also down-to-earth, clear prose. Like he's right there with you, guiding you through this intense experience with beauty and clarity.
And that clarity is so important because, well, some of this can be hard to grasp at first. Piers mentions that even how St. John of the Cross's work is sometimes divided up, it can be, well, a bit confusing. Thankfully, the editors have helped to make it clearer for us modern readers. But speaking of clarity, let's unpack this whole dark night idea. I think a lot of people, and I know I did at first, picture like the tough times, feeling alone, like God's not there.
It's a super common misunderstanding. See, the dark night, the way St. John of the Cross explains it, it's actually a path through those tough times, a refining process that ultimately brings you closer to God.
Okay, so not the darkness itself, but like a tunnel that leads to the light. But it's not just one dark night, right? There's two, the dark night of sense and the dark night of the spirit. What's the difference?
It's like a journey, different stages. Think of the dark night of sense as the first step. It's where God kind of starts weaning us off all those superficial things we cling to, in our spiritual lives.
Like needing the perfect prayer beads or meditation cushion to like prove how spiritual you are.
Exactly. It cuts through all that, purifies our desires. St. John of the Cross even gives us a list, like the common traps we fall into, especially at the beginning. Pride, greed, lust, anger, overindulgence, envy, laziness, all those tendencies that creep in and make our spiritual life more about us and less about God.
And he gives some pretty specific examples, right? Like how some folks, they get caught up in showing off how pious they are, wanting attention for their spirituality instead of focusing on real inner change.
He contrasts that with someone who might have, say, a simple, rough-hewn cross that they've used for years, finding just as much devotion in that as someone with a fancy gold-plated one. It's that inner disposition that matters. The heart, not the outward show.
So stripping away those superficial layers, the things we think will bring us closer to God, but actually just keep us stuck. And then what about the dark night of the spirit?
Well, if the dark night of sense is about letting go of those external things, the dark night of the spirit, it goes even deeper. It's about those subtle internal attachments, things that even seem good but can actually get in the way.
So we've ditched the fancy prayer beads. Now we're letting go of even deeper stuff. Like what?
Spiritual ego, for example. We might get all puffed up about our meditation practice or knowing scripture, even doing good deeds. But those things, they can become attachments too. They inflate our sense of self-importance. And that gets in the way of true humility, of surrendering to God.
Okay, so it's like beyond the surface, really getting to the core of who we are, a much deeper refinement. I'm starting to see why it's called a night, Like stripping away everything familiar, you'd feel lost, disoriented.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to remember. Even in this darkness, God is present. He's guiding us through it. And as we go through this, well, we actually start to see things more clearly. St. John of the Cross talks about a special kind of knowing, illumination. It comes from this very darkness.
That is fascinating. Sounds almost paradoxical, but I guess that's the point, right? It's in that emptying, that surrender that we can really understand.
You got it. It's like that saying, the wound is the place where the light enters you. It's not about suffering for the sake of suffering. It's about removing what's blocking us from God's light.
And what are some of the, well, I guess, the benefits of going through these dark nights? What's waiting for us on the other side?
Well, there's this striking image St. John of the Cross uses, a log of wood consumed by fire. It's not, a pleasant picture, but it shows how the soul transforms, becoming more and more like the fire itself.
Wow, that's powerful. You really see that transformative power.
As the soul is purified, there's deeper self-knowledge. We see ourselves more clearly, good and bad. That leads to humility, and we understand God's love in a new way.
Like the darkness strips away all the illusions, and what's left is this raw, true experience of ourselves and of God.
There's also growth in virtue, humility, detachment, pure, selfless love. And like you said, that illumination, a deeper intuitive grasp of spiritual truths, it's a knowing that goes beyond thinking. It's like a direct experience of the divine.
And all of this leads to, ultimately, a greater ability to be one with God. It's not just about getting through the darkness, it's about coming out the other side, changed, purified, ready for a deeper, more real relationship with God.
Exactly. The dark night's not the destination, it's the road to something much bigger. A journey of purification, transformation, leading to a more fulfilling, more genuine spiritual life.
So, we've talked about these two dark nights, how they purify, how they bring about a deeper understanding. But St. John of the Cross also uses this really interesting framework to describe the soul's journey, the 10 steps on the ladder of divine love. I think those steps were originally from St. Bernard and St. Thomas Aquinas, but St. John of the Cross really expands on them beautifully. Can you tell us more about this ladder?
It's like a map, in a way, of the soul's ascent to God. Each step is a deepening of love and a greater purification. We probably don't have time to go through all 10 today, but let's look at those first few, where that initial yearning for God takes hold and those worldly attachments start loosening their grip.
That sounds good. I'm really curious how he, brings these steps to life. He's known for such vivid images and metaphors, right?
Totally. He doesn't just describe them abstractly, he paints a picture. For example, that first step, he calls it a sickness of love. The soul loses its taste for worldly things and just yearns for God. It's this intense desire for something more, something real. Imagine you're so in love that nothing else matters.
I get it. It's like those classic love stories, poets pining for their beloved. But here, the beloved is God.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And as the soul moves forward, St. John of the Cross uses this image of a livery, a kind of uniform the soul wears on this journey. White for faith, green for hope, and purple for charity. They become these guiding principles, helping the soul navigate the darkness and find God.
So we have this image of the soul, clothed in the virtues, climbing this ladder of love, drawn upwards by that longing for something bigger, something truer. What do you think is the most crucial point here for people listening about the dark night?
What strikes me is how St. John of the Cross challenges us to rethink what we consider difficult or dark. What we see as negative, something to avoid, might actually be what leads us to greater light, to a deeper experience of God.
It really is a shift in perspective, isn't it? That maybe the path to true spiritual growth doesn't go around the darkness, but straight through it.
Yeah, it's a big shift. In St. John of the Cross, he really emphasizes this journey isn't like passive. He talks about something called infused contemplation, where God's actually working within the soul.
Okay, so infused contemplation. Could we maybe break that down a bit? For those of us who aren't, mysticism experts, what does that even mean?
It's like, imagine you're working on some creative project, right? And suddenly you get this burst of inspiration. It's like it comes from somewhere beyond you, almost like a gift, but you still have to put in the work to shape it, make it real. So in infused contemplation, God is the source of that inspiration, that grace, but the soul, it still has to actively participate, work with that divine action.
Ah, okay. So it's not just like sit back and let God handle it. It's more like a dance where God's leading, but we still have to follow the steps. And I'm guessing those steps aren't always easy based on how St. John of the Cross describes things.
He definitely doesn't shy away from the tough stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, he uses some pretty strong images to convey how intense this spiritual purification can be.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about the soul feeling like it's perishing and melting away in the, quote, darkness of its belly.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It almost sounds like a death, like a complete annihilation of the self. Why does he use such extreme language?
I think because he's trying to get across just how radical this change is. It's not about like tweaking a few habits or beliefs. It's about stripping away everything that's not of God, even things that seem good, holy on the surface. It's about reaching the state of total detachment, complete surrender to God's will.
So even those like spiritual achievements we might be proud of, the things we cling to for our identity, those have to be surrendered too. That sounds incredibly hard, even, I don't know, a bit scary.
It can be, definitely. And St. John of the Cross, he gets that. He describes this feeling of deep loneliness, even feeling like God has abandoned you. He compares it to like the suffering of souls in purgatory who long for God but feel separated from him.
That makes sense. If you're stripping away everything you identify with, everything you thought you knew about yourself and your relationship with God, it would feel empty, like being lost.
You're exactly right. But here's the key point St. John of the Cross emphasizes. This is necessary. It's a kind of spiritual crucible where the soul is refined, purified, It's through this darkness that true light emerges. He's saying sometimes we have to be completely emptied, stripped bare to truly see God.
Like that saying, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. And speaking of light, St. John of the Cross talks about how this dark night is actually a source of illumination. It seems counterintuitive, but I think I'm starting to see what he means.
It's a paradox, for sure.
Hmm.
But it's in this emptying, stripping away everything familiar that the soul opens up to a new kind of knowing, a divine illumination that goes beyond our normal ways of understanding.
He uses that example of King David in the Psalms, who talks about being in this desert land, waterless, dry, and pathless. And that's where he came to know God's virtue and glory. It's like you got to be stripped of all your comforts, all your preconceived notions to really encounter the divine.
Exactly. And this illumination, it's not just a one-time thing, it's ongoing. With moments of darkness and light, as God draws the soul closer to himself, it's a journey of purification and enlightenment, becoming more and more like God.
And one of the biggest outcomes of this journey is, well, a deeper love, right? I keep thinking back to that line, kindled in love with yearnings, how St. John of the Cross says this dark night, it ignites this fire of divine love within the soul.
A love born out of suffering and purification, deeper and more intense than anything the soul has ever felt. And it's this love that gives the soul the strength to overcome those challenges, to persevere through the darkness.
There's another part of that same stanza that keeps coming to mind. Go forth without being observed. It's like he's saying this love, this yearning for God, it gives the soul this freedom, this boldness to move forward without fear or hesitation.
You're right, that's crucial. The soul, empowered by divine love, can detach from all those things holding it back and move freely towards God. Like the love gives you wings to soar above the obstacles.
That brings us back to that image of the ladder, the 10 steps of divine love. How does that fit into all this?
Those 10 steps, they're like a structure for understanding how the soul ascends to God. It's a gradual transformation. Each step is a deeper level of love and purification.
And as we talked about, St. John of the Cross, he doesn't just, lay out these steps in a boring, theoretical way. He uses such vivid imagery and metaphors to bring them to life.
He really does. Like he compares the first step to a sickness of love, where the soul loses interest in worldly things and just craves God. Like it's consumed by love, nothing else matters.
I love that image. It really captures that feeling of being completely captivated by something, like nothing else matters.
And as the soul goes through these steps, it takes on those symbolic garments we mentioned. White for faith, green for hope, and purple for charity. They become the soul's armor, protecting it from the attacks of the devil, the temptations of the flesh.
It's like they're not just, abstract concepts, but real garments the soul puts on for protection and, well, adornment.
Exactly. They adorn the soul, making it more beautiful, more pleasing to God.
So we have this beautiful image, the soul clothed in the virtues, climbing that ladder of divine love, guided by the light that shines even in darkness. But as much as St. John of the Cross focuses on the positive, he's honest about the potential pitfalls, right?
Oh, absolutely. He warns about the devil, trying to deceive, mimicking those divine favors, trying to lead the soul astray. It's a real spiritual battle, the devil trying to sabotage the soul's progress at every turn.
That makes sense. If you're going through this intense purification, becoming more sensitive to spiritual things, wouldn't you also be more open to those kinds of deceptions?
For sure. And that's why St. John of the Cross, he gives guidance on how to tell the difference between true spiritual experiences and false ones. Humility, detachment, and obedience to spiritual direction, those are essential.
So it's not just about having those intense experiences. You need a way to understand them, test them against the wisdom of the church, and with the help of a spiritual director.
Exactly right. True spiritual favors, they lead to greater humility, not pride or self-importance. They lead to deeper surrender to God's will, not trying to control or manipulate those experiences.
And St. John of the Cross also talks about concealment, right? That sense of being hidden in God, safe from the enemy's attacks.
Yes, that's so important. It's a place of deep intimacy with God, where the soul is united with him in love, beyond the reach of any outside force. It's not about hiding from the world literally, but about finding that inner sanctuary, that connection to the source of true strength and peace.
It sounds truly transcendent, like a glimpse of heaven on earth. But also a reminder that even as we advance on this journey, we need to stay humble, recognizing that our growth, ultimately, it depends on God's grace.
Beautifully put. And, while St. John of the Cross gives us this map, he makes it clear this isn't a journey for the faint of heart. It takes courage, perseverance, and a willingness to surrender everything to God.
It's a call to radical discipleship, a path that leads through darkness to the ultimate light of union with God. We've really covered a lot, these two dark nights, all that purification, the challenges, and that incredible transformation at the end. But how does this, relate to someone listening right now? What if they're not like a mystic or a theologian? Can these teachings from St. John of the Cross actually be applied to, well, everyday life?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? How do we take these deep spiritual insights and make them relevant to our own lives? One way, I think, is to see the Dark Night not as some, far-out concept for saints and mystics, but as a metaphor for those tough times we all go through.
Like those times you feel lost, confused, maybe even like God's abandoned you, a personal crisis, a big loss, a time of doubt, questioning. Everyone's been there, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And instead of fighting those experiences, pushing them away, St. John of the Cross, he says, lean into them, see them as uncomfortable as they are, as chances to grow, to be purified.
To see the darkness not as the end, but as a passage to something new, like when you prune a plant, cutting back what's dead to let new life come in.
Perfect analogy.
Hmm.
And just like the Dark Night ultimately leads to a deeper love for God, those tough times in our lives can lead us to love ourselves more deeply, love others, love life itself.
Yeah.
It's about finding that light, even in the darkness, the love that gets us through.
It makes me think about what we discussed earlier, those virtues, faith, hope, and charity, like armor or a guide for the soul. Do you think those apply here too? Can they help us through those personal dark nights?
Definitely. They become like anchors, guiding lights. They help us navigate the darkness and find our way back to that place of peace, that union with God. Faith, it gives us that trust. Even when things are tough, God's still there. Hope reminds us this darkness isn't the end, there's light ahead. And charity, that love for God and others, it gives us the strength to keep going, reach out for support, be compassionate to others who are struggling too.
It's a good reminder. And it also makes me think about another thing St. John of the Cross talks about, spiritual direction. Having a spiritual guide, someone to, walk with us through those tough times. Could that be helpful with those personal dark nights too?
Oh, for sure. It's not about someone telling you what to do, how to feel, but having a wise, compassionate person to help you figure out what's going on, to offer support, encouragement, and help you stay grounded in those core principles, faith, hope, love. Someone to remind you when you feel alone that you're not alone on this journey.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even though St. John of the Cross is writing about these really intense mystical experiences, it seems like the core ideas they can apply to anyone who wants a deeper, more real spiritual life.
Exactly. He's giving us a map, a framework for understanding the challenges and those amazing possibilities of spiritual growth. Whether you go through a full-blown dark night of the soul or just those times of darkness and difficulty that are part of life, his teachings offer guidance, hope, and in the end, a path to a closer, more fulfilling relationship with God.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there like one final thought or a question you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to think about as they, keep exploring this fascinating world of Christian mysticism?
Well, if the dark night is really necessary for spiritual growth, as St. John of the Cross says, how can we, recognize those times of darkness in our own lives? Even embrace them, see them not as failures, but as opportunities for change, for a deeper union with God.
That's a really powerful question, and I think something we all need to consider on our own spiritual journeys. It's not about, seeking out suffering, but about being open to the ways even the toughest experiences can transform us. And if you want to keep exploring these ideas, I highly recommend checking out Dark Night of the Soul. It's a challenge for sure, but ultimately incredibly rewarding. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep seeking